Hello and welcome to this episode in Dr. K's Psychobabble. And in this episode, we are going to be looking at the behavioral technique of chaining. Now, chaining is an important tool to have when we are trying to teach complex skills. When we have simple skills, we can use the ABC contingency theory, clearly define the behavior that we want to see done, manipulate the antecedents, manipulate the consequences, and we can have a behavior management plan. But what do we do if the behavior is complex? Now, what we are to do is to actually take that behavior and divide it into small pieces, and we can teach each one of those pieces individually. Now, what I'm going to use is actually one that we're all very familiar with, and that is washing hands. Not only are we familiar with washing hands, but our world, as I record this in the middle of the global COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen signs for washing hands all over the place. And so the steps for washing your hands are very clearly laid out. So I didn't have to make up any of that. So let's take a look at the task of washing hands. And the job tool that I have, the graphic that depicts all the different steps, looks like this. We have a total of 12 steps, including observing our nice clean hands at the end. We have wet hands, apply soap, rub hands, lather the backs, scrub between your fingers, rub the backs of fingers on the opposing palm, clean your thumbs, wash fingernails and fingertips, rinse hands, dry with a single-use towel, use the towel to turn off the faucet. Your hands are clean. Probably should include throwing away the towel, but it's not in this one. So what we do when we are using the chaining method is we take a complex behavior like washing hands and we divide it into these little pieces and we begin to teach them. Now, let me tell you about some of the science behind this before we go into the actual teaching process. So, building upon what we already know about behavior management, we have an initial prompt. So a person tells, time to wash your hands. That's the initial stimulus. We might even show them the job tool. Time to wash your hands, and we point to the job tool. The job tool will always be a good thing to have around so that people can follow that from step to step. That initial prompt is actually a stimulus for the individual to wet their hands, which is the first step. That is a response. So we have here in chaining, we're actually evoking classical conditioning, not operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is the stimulus response. When somebody tells me to wash my hands, as long as I can figure out the first step, rinse my hands in water, that's the first step, then I can move through the subsequent steps. In chaining, the response of wetting the hands actually is the stimulus for the next step, applying the soap. And that is a response. So there's a stimulus response chain of behaviors when we use chaining to create a complex behavior. So let's look at this. I'm using S and R for my stimulus response. We apply the soap. That response becomes the stimulus for rubbing hands palm to palm, which is the response. That becomes the stimulus for lather the backs of your hands. That's the response. That becomes the stimulus for scrub between your fingers. That response becomes the stimulus for rub the backs of fingers on opposing palms, etc. So let's look at all of these and how do we actually go about teaching. Now, there are two general methods of teaching chaining. One is called forward chaining and the other one is called backward chaining. And it simply has to do with how many steps you as a teacher are going to do with the individual while they're learning these skills and where the reinforcement goes. So let me first cover an example about how you might start teaching using forward chaining and then using the reinforcer to reward the individual for achieving as much as they can. So we look at here and we start with of course, it's time to wash hands. We point at the job tool, that's that, and the individual successfully wets their hands, and we provide a reinforcer. At this point, we then, as the teacher, guide the person with as much as they need to finish the task. But they do the first step independently. Maybe a couple times of that, we want them to do the next step independently. So we'll say wash hands, and kind of look and pause. The person rinses their hands, but will that be enough? Depending, again, how much prompting do you need for them to get to the next step? And that is how we teach the next step. So we move into the next trial. They have to do this step and then this step independently to receive the reward. And then we go on for the third one. They have to do this step and then this step before they get the reinforcer. You can see how it's moving forward in terms of the learning. They're learning the first step, then the second step, then the third step. And as far as they can go independently, that's when the reinforcer happens. Now, if they fly right through the first 5 independently and they have a stuck point, that's okay too. This is depending on how the person is learning all of this stuff, whatever. Now, there's another method, and that is backward chaining. Now, when we do backward chaining, we actually do basically hand over hand all the way to the end until the last step. Then they have to do the last step themselves. So in this case, the last step is basically observing the hands are clean, but the last step is really use the towel to turn off the faucet. So we have guided them through all of these different steps, and then they have to do the last one independently, and they get the reinforcer. They look at their hands, they're able to get that. The next trial, we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They do 10, they do 11, they get the reinforcer. Third trial, we're doing it with them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They do 9, 10, and 11 and get their reward. This can be a very, very powerful way of teaching complex skills. Everything from simply washing hands to social skills, to filling out forms, to anything that you can put into a stepwise a recipe. Any one of these things you can put into a stepwise fashion and then reinforce. Ultimately, what you want is to be able to say, time to wash your hands. They have the skill sheet right in front of them if they need it, and they get their reinforcer when they get it done. Now that skill sheet, of course, can be swapped out for any other series of other skills that you want them, whether it's making toast or mowing the lawn. Anything that you can put into steps would be taught that way. So that's an example of using chaining. You can see the classical conditioning in terms of the stimulus response. There's some way you can kind of also view it as completing something as a reinforcer for the previous. So not only is it a response, but it's a reinforcer for the previous one. That's a little, if we really want to analyze it very deeply, I like stimulus response better. And each response becomes the stimulus for the next because they're memorizing the order in which these are done. And that's principally what you want. You don't want the soap to go on last. You want them in order. So I think the stimulus response way of looking at this is a little bit more accurate. And it allows you to take complex skills and use the idea of a single reinforcer depending on how much independence the individual shows. So that's it for today's Psychobabble. Make sure you subscribe below, and I look forward to our next time together. Take care.